A couple of questions came up in the as in the echo of my rant yesterday. Or it wasn't even a rant. I think it was more like a college course on the history of bilateral therapies and their use for treating post-traumatic stress disorder and the nature of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I just wanted to address those because I just find this stuff absolutely fascinating, which is why I've actually written 2 books about it, but the main one is Walking Your Blues Away. And I think it's one of the most important books I've ever written. And there are many other good books on this topic as well. I'm not trying to pitch my book at you. It's just that, writing the book helped make me an expert on the topic. And so that's why I'm going to tell you, everything I'm going to tell you, you don't need to buy the book, right? But there are also books on EMDR, which Francine Shapiro, if I'm remembering her name correctly, invented or came up with and trademarked, and other kinds of bilateral therapies. The beginning point for this is that post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, the hallmark characteristic of PTSD is that people remember a past event as if it was today, as if it happened today. If a person has that as a presenting symptom, that is the most significant factor that says this is actually PTSD. And the reason for that is there's this part of the brain, the hypothalamus, or the hippocampus, excuse me. I was using the wrong word yesterday. I was saying hypothalamus, it's the hippocampus. The hippocampus that is a one-day scratch pad for the brain. And it doesn't know time. It doesn't know past and future. It only knows now. And so if something happens today, whatever happens today, I mean, everything that's happening to all of us today, tonight when we go to sleep, assuming that we don't take sleeping pills that prevent REM sleep, and this is one of the reasons why regular, frequent use of the more powerful sleeping pills actually can produce anxiety disorders and a whole range of psychiatric problems, is because you don't get to process your day when you sleep, and they also impair memory, long-term memory, short-term memory as well. What happens is when you go to sleep at night, as best anybody can tell, is that the hippocampus says, okay, here's what happened during the day, and it just dumps that stuff into the brain, into the thinking brain. The whole brain. The hippocampus is this little tiny part of the brainstem, or the lower brain. And the whole brain says, okay, how do I make sense out of this? Well, we'll put this over here, and we'll put this over there, and we experience this as dreaming. And the brain sorts information by emotion rather than by logic, and there's a whole fascinating subset of neuro-linguistic programming, of NLP in there that is fascinating to teach, but it's beyond the scope of today's conversation. The problem that produces PTSD comes when the hippocampus experiences, when a person experiences something during the day that is so horrible that the rest of their brain can't deal with it. Now, that's so horrible is an entirely subjective experience. 2 different people might see a car accident, and one will be absolutely traumatized by it to the point that they will have post-traumatic stress disorder for years, and another person will just say, oh yeah, it was a car accident. So whether it's being the victim of some kind of abuse, or whether it's the having somebody die, or whether it is being in war and being shot at, or shooting somebody, taking a life of another person, being part of a company, a group of people that took the lives of other people, whatever it may be, it is something that one individual at some moral cognitive level can't handle while they're asleep. And so the hippocampus tries to dump it into the brain. When the person falls asleep, the brain says, no way, I'm not taking that. You just hang on to it. And the next day, the person wakes up, and the emotions associated with that experience are just as fresh as they were the day before. And then that night they go to sleep and the hippocampus tries to dump it. And the brain says, I ain't taking it. You keep it. And the next day they wake up and that memory is just as fresh as it was the day before. And that continues day after day after day for months and then years. And that's post-traumatic stress disorder. So what we've learned is over the years is that one of the ways, now this is not a cure-all. This isn't, instant. This doesn't work for everybody. But it works a lot for, I would say, most people. What we know is that if you can get a person to touch the edge of that memory, don't try to digest the entire thing all at once, but touch the edge of that memory while they are engaging in a task that alternately stimulates the left hemisphere of the brain and the right hemisphere of the brain. And the way that Franz Anton Mesmer taught us back in the 1770s, and then James Braid in the 1830s when he renamed mesmerism as hypnosis, and the Sigmund Freud did up until 1897. And you'll recall my telling you the whole story about why Freud stopped hypnosis yesterday. And Milton Erickson brought it back in the 1950s. I couldn't remember his last name yesterday, it just popped into my brain. And Milton Erickson, his work became the basis of Richard Bandler and John Grindler's work in inventing NLP that brought this stuff forward, is that it doesn't necessarily need to be just moving your eyes from side to side looking at a pocket watch. That it can be literally walking, which is a bilateral activity where you're going left, right, left, right, left, right, if your hands are swinging and they're free. And there's a whole lot of other ways to do it. Freud used to rub people down the side of their bodies, down their arms or down their chest if it was a man, alternate sides, left, right, left, right. I have a friend who's writing a book right now about this kind of therapy where he's suggesting you just can stand and move from left foot to right foot. I've been with Native Americans and with Aboriginal people in Africa where dancing is basically, it's not anything like anything you'd see in a dance club in the United States. It's people standing in very orderly fashion, sometimes in a line, and they're simply moving from left foot to right foot, left foot to right foot, left foot to right foot, standing in place. And they do it for hours. This is bilateral therapy. These are all ways, and while engaged in this bilateral activity, you then, the person then takes on a little tiny bit of the memory, and takes increasingly larger pieces of it, and over a period of time, and it can be, for some people, it's as little as a half hour. For some people, it takes days. But over time, they process that memory and diminish its intensity in the hippocampus and move it into the cortex, into the thinking part of the brain, where that night it's able to be processed and stored. And the experience that people will tell you the next day, or 2 days later, 3 or 4 days later, in some cases a week or month later, is when you ask them, where is that memory? They used to say, it's right here in front of me. And now they say, oh, it's about 10 feet behind me and it's black and white. It's in my past. So this is what I shared with you yesterday, and when I learned this, I wrote this book, Walking Your Blues Away. And the questions that came up are a couple of questions. One, does this apply to depression or anxiety? And I've got an answer for that I'll give you after the break. And the other is, can blind people do this? And I think given the description that I just gave about how you can even just stand in place and move from side to side, it should become fairly obvious or evident that yes, blind people can do this as well. And because it doesn't require eyes moving from side to side. It just requires activating the left side of the brain, right side of the brain, left side of the brain, right side of the brain. So anyhow, the principal ways that post-traumatic stress disorder is dealt with, the goal of all of the various therapies is to incrementally take a memory that the hippocampus can't get rid of because the rest of the brain won't take it, and get it out of the hippocampus. And the two principal ways that this is done are, number one, with bilateral therapies like EMDR and others that I described to you before the break. And the second one is giving people drugs that numb them enough that they can process this stuff without freaking out. These are typically the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors or benzodiazepine drugs like Valium, the SSRIs or things like Prozac. They give people these drugs, and then under the influence of the drug, they do psychotherapy where they revisit the memory, but now they're basically numbed to the point that they can process it. And both of these techniques demonstrate some success. In fact, both of these techniques demonstrate a fair amount of success. But it's got to be dealt with. With regard to depression and anxiety disorders, and I write about this I read about it in Walking Your Blues Away. I also wrote about it in Healing ADD, which is really, originally I wrote this as a book on neuro-linguistic programming. And so it's like a whole bunch of different NLP techniques. And my publisher said, nobody wants to read a book about NLP, but you've got a couple of bestsellers. Time Magazine had just done a story about my first book on ADD. He said, everybody wants to know about ADD and they want to hear about it from you. So rewrite this book talking about how you can use these NLP techniques to help people who have been wounded by growing up having ADD in a public school system. And so it's called Healing ADD, but it's really an NLP book. And what I point out in both these books, and this is, again, not unique to me. Read the readings of Robert Dilts or Richard Bandler or John Grinder or any of, Connie Ray Andreas. I mean, there's some really good stuff out there. Is that anxiety tends to be a future-centered disorder and depression tends to be a past-centered disorder. In other words, people who experience depression chronically are constantly remembering past events for which they feel shame, typically shame, but one of the dark emotions associated with the past. They may not even remember specifically what the event is, but there's something there that keeps pulling them back. And it really needs to be treated as if it was PTSD. I mean, it can be treated using bilateral therapies or cognitive behavioral therapy associated with pharmaceuticals or even without pharmaceuticals. A variety of these, but it's basically a person constantly revisiting their past. And so for many people, just that understanding is enough for them to get past their depression because they learn how to live in the present. Living in the present is, and if you want more on this, look up mindfulness, or vipassana is the Indian word, the Hindu word for it. But vipassana training, mindfulness training, is learning to live in the present. And there's a very simple exercise that Milton Erickson's wife came up with for actually going to sleep. But it's a great exercise for simply becoming present in the here and now, which cuts the anchor to the past and diminishes, or in many cases ends, clinical depression. And that is to simply come to the moment. And the way you come to the moment is by noticing different senses in a circular fashion, in a repeating fashion. So you notice what you're seeing right now. Notice the colors. Notice the brightness. Notice the shape of things. Notice what you're seeing. And then notice what you're hearing. The sound of my voice, the space between the words, the tonality, the other sounds in the room, or wherever you may be. Just notice the sea of sound that you live in. And then notice what you're feeling. Are your shoes tight? Are you sitting? Do you feel the weight of your body on your butt? Or are you laying down? Whatever you may be doing. Notice the feelings, the sensations in your body. What we're doing is these are called modality shifts. We're going through the sensory modalities. There's basically 6 of them. And notice what you're smelling right now. Notice what you're tasting, what's in your mouth. And notice your sense of balance, the vestibular system, your inner ear. In other words, your relationship to vertical and horizontal. Those are the 6 senses that we have direct access to and we can immediately notice. And then just go back to noticing what you're seeing and then go through them. And Betty Erickson's technique was to go through these things 3 times. And if you do that as you're laying in bed trying to fall asleep, you will fall asleep. You put yourself into a hypnotic trance, essentially. But if you just do it once, while you're here and now, right now, it brings you to the present. There's nothing I know of, and I learned this, the first time I learned this, it was at a Soto Zen Center in Atlanta, Georgia, where Louise and I used to go every Sunday, and we would sit for a half hour, and I mean literally just sit facing a wall, all around a room. Everybody's sitting on a cushion facing the wall, and you sit there silently for a half hour with your eyes open, looking down your nose at whatever happens to be on that wall. It was a stone wall. And just notice as stuff comes up in your brain. And the guy who taught me how to do this, he said, the first thing you want to do before you sit is you want to become present. And to become present, what you do is notice what you're seeing, notice what you're hearing, notice what you're feeling, notice what you're smelling and tasting, notice your relationship to the room. And just essentially say to yourself, I am here now. And constantly try to keep coming back to that. Every time your mind wanders off into some thought train about, what's going to happen. So depression is when the past intrudes. Anxiety is when the future intrudes. Anxiety is when people imagine a horrible future and they imagine it in the present. And so the solution for anxiety is essentially the same as it is for depression, which is become present. And then if there is something in the past or something in the future that is, a real trigger, you can deal with it with bilateral therapies. You can deal with it with a variety of forms of psychotherapy. And some people even deal with it with psychedelics. We'll be back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program.